separately, and at the time they worked in coalition against the French. However, during the first Indo-Chinese War, it becomes a clear project of the Communist Party to begin consolidating power. So what I have in citations, and this is a brand new citation, is the circumstance of Nguyen Thi Nam. Nguyen Thi Nam in the north was wealthy, a landowner. At a certain point, she owned a good like couple thousand acres, and quite conspicuously, also one of the absolute OG supporters of the Vietnam, of the communists, personally housed them, personally fed, clothed, and protected Ho Chi Minh, all of his lieutenants, personally from the French. Although she was rich, she had both of her sons volunteer to work with the anti-French revolutionaries in the Vietnam and the communists. When the land reform started as a pilot program in 1953, she was victim number one. And the question that was presented in this research article that I literally just found a couple of days ago is, why was this person who contributed so much to in the service of driving the French out of Vietnam, in giving everything that she had in the service of liberating the country, why was she target number one? And the answer is, at least politically speaking, the Vietnamese Communist Party, at its initial points, really wanted to transform the entirety of Vietnamese society, really laid the fault and blame of why Vietnamese society was the way that it was at the hands of the rich. But the problem was the rich were very helpful in trying to help liberate the country from the French. So without outside assistance, they could not fully transform everything. But then they got Chinese and Soviet assistance, and therefore the extermination of people who were explicitly helping the people could begin apace. But it's at this point that we need to touch base about the place in which we all live, which is to say America, which is to say, at this point, in terms of like the American narrative about Vietnam, it's almost overwhelmingly like having been determined by the narratives of the anti-war movement. At which point, this is the only time I will ever touch on the like academic credentials of the anti-war movement. So, to counter the bloodbath image, and especially Pham Nhat Chi and Nixon's claims, Gareth Porter published in 1972 The Myth of the Bloodbath, North Vietnam's Land Reforms Were Considered. Basically saying that any hypothesis of incredible discrimination and mass killings and executions in the prosecution of land reform is all fake. That was published in 1972. Much of the data on land reform and the argument used by Gareth Porter and others in this camp to explain the errors were taken directly from Trung Phuong's 1968 edited volume, Vietnam of Vietnam. So basically, they took it directly from the communist sources and presented it entirely uncritically. That is their entire process. Now, as a final capstone on like the anti-war movement, I am sympathetic and understand the perspective that people don't want like their brothers and others to die in the war, but that doesn't excuse their research practice. That's pretty much it. This makes it so that the population of Vietnamese Americans in this area goes from about less than 5,000 in the 1980s to presently over 300,000 in Southern California alone. This is not including Florida. This is not to say that everyone liked it. I have a quote here from George Dugmesian, a Republican. Will the last American to leave Garden Grove please bring the flag? And City Council member Frank Fry told organizers in 1989 that it's my opinion that you're all Americans and you better be Americans. If you want to be South Vietnamese, you can go back to South Vietnam, the country that stopped existing in 1975. Nevertheless, we're still here. A partition of the country with the Geneva Accords as the big men treated with the French to effectively cede half the country to them. And the other thing to take into account is that the war that you think of as the Vietnam War, the war that America was directly involved in, is a war of choice. the big thing that to take away is that despite the fact that communists were consistently politically assassinating all of their political enemies in the First Indochinese War, in 1954, once the French surrendered, like the nationalists and the communists all met with each other, and the nationalists offered forming a coalition government. That was rejected. And then the French decided to give half the country to the communists. And that agreement was never agreed upon by anyone in the South or any other Vietnamese. But it happened anyways. And so one forced migration as litigated by the International World Order in 54, and then a subsequent negotiation in 75, and then that's how we get here. That's how we set up this. And as you can see in all these various shop fronts, you can see that this is a mini mall, yes, but it has a particular function in terms of the early business history of these refugees, which is to say, what is your credit score when you're a refugee? It's like goose. How do you get seed money to start any business? It's pretty much impossible. What you can do instead is like corral together a bunch of money from a bunch of different families, enough to rent out one of these shops out of this mini mall. So a lot of businesses start from really, really small shop like this, become successful, or fail. Lots of them fail, most of them fail. But some become successful, get enough to rent out from other locations, and head down further. So you can see that since this is the actual originating spot of Little Saigon in particular, this is the actually most ethnically diverse section of Little Saigon. The further you get down, the further you get out, those are the people having the money to build out, buy out their individual location, which is why this is still some of the best places to get like really traditional Southern Chinese cooking. But that's kind of like a whole that's kind of all holdovers. Inevitably, I'm going to fuck up is build more, like, because that would require a capitalist solution. However, that is literally the only solution to the problem. And every single like hypothetical, like, what about social housing? It's just like, at the end of the day, the actual solution is a capitalist solution. You don't like that because of the ideology, but they're having real difficulty expressing like high civic participation, because that's just not how shit works in Vietnam right now. Is a Buddhist saint only if you're Chinese. It's pretty much the clearest way to like ethnically signify, yes, our originators are Chinese Vietnamese. It doesn't happen otherwise. Like ethnically kin people, like, who are the majority in Vietnam, don't do it, and it's still an explicit signifier of an ethnic subpopulation that created and set it up. But this is the kind of point of origination for a lot of things in terms of like the positiveness and like business oriented stuff. And although no one agreed to the partition, the remaining half of the country in the south took the yellow flag on the left to be their flag, which was their flag from 1954 until 1975. And upon suggestion of their inclusion, many members of the public decided to show up to protest the inclusion of anything commemorating any Vietnamese soldier or the people of Vietnam whatsoever, ignoring the fact that there was another empire out there at the time. So if America wasn't going to contest that power, if the Soviet Union was there at the northern border facilitating the wholesale eradication of Vietnamese society, who was going to stop them? It's simple enough to say that, like, in the present moment, that the United States police powers are questionable and unjustifiable. But if the solution that the anti-war movement was to simply do nothing in the face of not just benevolence, like communist expansion, but actual benevolence, because frankly, if it were about liberation and in the pursuit of democracy and communism, they killed most of them. This leads to the dynamic where all the people who were participants and allies of the communists are some of the people who hate them the fucking most. rate had to be reduced. The daily allowance for rifles was set to 1.6 rounds per man. Cliff said the daily allowance for Americans while they were still in the war was 13 rounds. For machine guns, it was 10.6 rounds. It was 165 per day for the Americans. For mortars, it was 1.3 rounds, 16.9 for the Americans. While we were conserving, the enemy was profligate. At Thonglei-Chan border camp, soldiers of the Communist Army shelled the base 300 times, using more than 10,000 rounds over a 16-week period. Most of these plaques are pretty boilerplate. In honor of all who served, etc., etc., etc. There's one that is different. Benmigek Ali is conspicuous as one of the earliest and most successful Benmi places in the whole community. They are refugee-owned, always have been, but conspicuously, their plaque of dedication is in memory of South Vietnamese soldiers who died for Vietnamese freedom. That seems a little angry by omission. And if they seem a little angry, it might be because people showed up in City Hall to say that they were a bunch of fucking cowards. We're undeserving of commemoration. In terms of the actual total number of casualties, if you're only counting like Republic of Vietnam soldiers, the total number of armed forces of the Republic of Vietnam casualties is 1,400,000. The total number of American soldier casualties for the entirety of the war is 58,000. If you are not terribly good at math, like I am, that is a 23 times multiplier. But, as you should have learned in school, the Americans largely withdrew by 1973. So the proportion of those casualties is a little. If we assume that the total proportion of casualties between Americans to Vietnamese is about 3 times. So 6 times 3, that's going to be 18. So 180,000. This means that in the 2 remaining years between the American withdrawal in 73 and the end of the war in 1975, that is 1,200,000 dead in 2 years. And as depicted in the fictional novel but based on true events novel Lotus in the Storm, the war was over as far as the Americans were concerned. They had peace at last and the tincture of honor plus the release of 591 prisoners of war. Soon after the Paris Agreement was signed, the North stopped its lip-licking and attacks. Here was the bewildering military reality. 13 enemy divisions and 75 regiments, more than 160,000 troops in all, were still in place in our country. There were also arms and troops that poured down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, more than 4 times the number that took part in prior attacks. The Air Force was ordered to reduce air support, tactical airlifts, and reconnaissance flights by more than half, and to reduce heli lifts by 70%. We were told to retire more than 200 aircraft and cancel pre-existing orders for upgrades. We were instructed to recall 400 pilots from training in the United States. The Navy inactivated more than 600 vessels and rivercraft and reduced river patrols by 72%. Not one plane, ship, or boat was replaced after the peace treaty. Documentaries like Ken Burns' Vietnam War tend to portray Vietnamese soldiers as weak and cowardly and make quite a lot of hay out of the video of them throwing off their uniforms. If you see any pictures of burning tanks in Vietnam as everything ended in 1975, the burning tanks are not as a result of communists having struck them. The burning tanks is because they literally stopped working in the middle of the road, and the South Vietnamese army had to burn them in order to keep them from getting into enemy hands. Oh wait, I completely forgot one of the Republic of Vietnam after the withdrawal of the Americans in defending Vietnamese territorial sovereignty from Chinese incursion. Its political significance is to contrast itself to the relationship between the existing regime and Chinese sovereign incursions, which is a shared political project with the Philippines, as China currently claims ownership over the entirety of the South China Sea, and obviously, since that is the territorial waters of both Vietnam and the Philippines, they both have issues about it. Unfortunately, in terms of exerting military might, the best both countries have to offer at this point is, this is a really sad joke, but karaoke battles. Was agreed to. When the Americans agreed, made the decision to leave in 1973 in the Paris Peace Accords, the Republic of Vietnam was not there. We did not agree, and no one. And once again, no one cared. Died as the nation fell. This is not to valorize them as perfect individuals or to like talk about the particulars and like about to represent like the Republic as the sort of perfect nation. There is no such thing. However, even in light of their failures to defend the nation being resulted not from their own efforts, they still decided to stay with their charges, which is to say, when the country fell, so did they and their whole family. The particularly grim detail is that not every single person was prepared in terms of preparing beforehand to die for the country when everything went south, which is to say, some people knew that things were going to go south and prepared like easy suicide options for themselves and their families. Some people got poison pills beforehand. Some people did not. Which is to say, then you have to decide the order. And contrary to any notions of like cowardice, the few generals who were able to make it overseas, who were able to escape, a fair number of them decided to return as literal paramilitaries and then died. And because I think that was the right page in terms of reference, but this was dedicated in 2009. It took quite a long time in order to get the funds together to even get it up and operational, because the particulars of the Boat People organization refusing to take any money from people who were actually victims themselves. It took quite a while to get everything together. At the original dedication of this memorial in 2009, at the original version of this org in particular, and this monument in particular, made a particularly brave political choice of featuring no national flag whatsoever. Both people came from all over Vietnam, and were not particularly affiliated with any one regime in particular, but were shared in their attempts to leave the current regime. In terms of actual statistics, from 1975 to 1997, according to the UNHCR, about over 800,000 Vietnamese arrived in refugee camps in Southeast Asia and Hong Kong. They arrived mostly by boat. About 42,000 arrived by land in Thailand. 700 were eventually resettled, but as a case in point, when they started capturing statistics of just one year, in 1981, that year 452 boats carrying Vietnamese boat people arrived in Thailand, carrying a total of about 15,000 refugees. Of those boats, 349 had been attacked by pirates, an average of 3 times each. 228 women had been abducted, 881 people were dead or missing. Up until that point, every single boat that left Vietnam as a part of either explicit or implicit national strategy were attacked, robbed, raped by pirates and people attacking refugees on the way out. But the Boat People organization remains, and Boat People in general remain, some of the most politically active and politically extremist in terms of their relationships with states in general, and unequivocally some of the most traumatized remaining. In terms of personal stories, yeah, one of my relatives has their names in one of these stones. They have since, in the time subsequently, taken to commemorating these online in memorials. But in particular sections, these are names of people who remembered of those confirmed dead. And in some particular circumstances, it is this person's name and their whole family. As a kind of capstone to all of this, I wanted to go ahead and perform this song by a terrorist. This is Mayembe, or translated title, Invite You Home, by Việt. Author Nia Bach, and the UNHCR, anywhere between 200,000 and 250,000 boat people lost their lives at sea.
It's more than that.
Most of them overwhelmingly civilians, women, children.
The new estimate is like almost 500,000.
Emergent out of choices. It is emergent out of choices to continue a war in 54. It is emergent out of choices that were foisted upon people who did not agree, and nevertheless it happened. Conspicuously, at the dedication for this memorial in 2009, there was a gentleman who came up to the dais while there were elected officials in attendance who screamed into the microphone, "You left us to die. Our relatives are dead because of you." The last couple of times I was here, there was a gentleman who came down all the way from Canada because one of his loved ones was a dead boat people. He mentioned that his sister had responded to the trauma of it in the quite opposite way, in which she avoided all of it as much as humanly possible. Normally, when this monument is filled, it is supposed to be in the shape of the average size of the boats that took people all the way from Vietnam, frequently to Malaysia, sometimes as far as the Philippines. In one of the absolute worst cases, there was a boat that was stranded at sea for 52 days, ran out of food and water, and did have to resort to cannibalism. Tôi muốn mời em về thăm lại giai đoạn xưa, khi tâm như say nắng đứng môi nở phương xưa. Tôi muốn mời em về những quê hương tôi quá xa bên kia bờ thái bên bao la. Tôi muốn mời em về những chim đã nhảy cánh, những mây đã ngừng bay, cho tôi thầm lại nơi này. Tôi muốn mời em về thăm lại căn nhà xưa, có mẹ ngồi đâu đó, mái tóc bạc đông đưa. Tôi muốn mời em về thăm lại phố phường xưa, những chiều trời mưa phủ, lời yêu nói sâu vừa. Tôi muốn mời em về những quê hương tôi quá xa bên kia bờ thái bên bao la. Tôi muốn mời em về những chim đã gãy cánh, những mây đã ngừng bay, cho tôi cộng hai nơi này. 2013, age 55. He died in Fountain Valley, forming a mainstay of multiple diasporic news programs, radio programs, his allegiance was always turning back to nations. Yeah, whatever works for you. Yeah, just wait. There could be a unified government with the Communist Party coincided with others. It's not the craziest thing in the world. But it did. And so, the question of what happens to a national cemetery once that nation stops existing is answered by this question, which is to say, it stopped existing. A couple years after everything ended, they put a bulletin out that if you weren't able to pay for the collection fees, they were just going to throw the remains of your loved ones, if they weren't in the cemetery, into a mass grave. Okay, more, and that there's actually that all of this is largely defunct, and that we are able to freely express both our histories, our grief, and everything that happened to us in the state of Vietnam. I would love to tell you that. Still isn't true, but I would love to tell you. But anyhow, people who didn't, right. This is largely for people who didn't have the money. Nevertheless, people tried and failed. But it's part of a larger ecosystem of decisions and part of a larger political creation. The Vietnamese operating as though they are a government in exile and something outside of American society of the world to form the way to establish standards for themselves, and still think about themselves. And the reason we end up here is because not every pho restaurant contributed to it, and not every pho restaurant from the 80s is still in existence. But this one existed in the 80s and definitely contributed. It's right there in the name. 1954 is the forced migration of Northerners into the South and the division of the country. So everything comes full circle, and here we are. And if you are so inclined, if you did not already get enough sugar in your boba, 7 Lays is right across the way.